In the mid-1980 seconds, Hollywood believed it had found something rare, not just a star, but a standard. When Val Kilmer walked onto the screen as Iceman in Top Gun, the audience didn't just see confidence, they saw control. The clean jawline, the cool stare, the voice that never shook. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. Power radiated from stillness. Executives saw a leading man they could build franchises around for decades. But fate had a different script in mind. Look at the man today, a ghost in a silk scarf. A man who once possessed the most commanding voice in Hollywood, now reduced to a whisper that sounds like sandpaper on stone. Most people think his career died because he was difficult to work with. They think he was just an arrogant actor who faded away. They are wrong. The Smoking Gun isn't a bad movie or a lost contract. It was a terrifying night in Malibu in January 2015. Val Kilmer was found coughing up thick, dark blood, his throat swollen to the size of an orange. He couldn't swallow. He couldn't breathe. And yet, for years, he had done nothing. Because Val Kilmer didn't just believe in his own talent. He believed in a reality where sickness was an illusion and where prayer was a substitute for medicine. Today, we reveal how a man worth $50 million chose a miracle over science and lost everything in the process. This is not just a biography. This is a cautionary tale about the price of hubris. It is a story about a man who believed art came before obedience, only to realize that the system and the body always win in the end. It's about the betrayal of talent, the ruin of a fortune, and the cruelty of fate that takes away the one thing you value most. Why did the Iceman wait until his voice was gone to finally start telling the truth? Today, we go behind the scenes of the most hated man in Hollywood to find the broken boy underneath. We look at the cigar burns, the financial collapse, and the hole in a legend's throat. This is the heartbreaking reality of Val Kilmer. To understand the fall, we have to understand the height. Val Kilmer was never just an actor. He was a prodigy. At 17, he became the youngest student ever accepted into the prestigious Juilliard School in New York. But unlike his peers, Kilmer wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing meaning. That distinction mattered more than anyone realized because in Hollywood, ambition is tolerated, defiance is not. Before the money, before the box office crowns, Kilmer was already different. Juilliard trained, obsessed with Shakespeare, intensely intellectual in an industry that preferred charm over depth. He didn't want to repeat himself. He didn't want to play the same man twice. And most dangerously, he didn't believe studios were the final authority over his craft. To Hollywood, this sounded like arrogance. To Kilmer, it was survival. He burst onto the scene with top secret and real genius. He was funny, he was handsome, and he had a terrifying intelligence behind his eyes. He looked down on the business of Hollywood before he even conquered it. To Val, if you weren't suffering for the role, you weren't doing it right. And then came the moment that would define him forever. 1986, Top Gun. Here is the irony that would haunt his career. Val Kilmer hated Top Gun. He thought the script was silly. He thought the character was thin. He actually tried to sabotage his own audition to avoid getting the part. But the camera loved him. When he stepped into the role of Iceman, he became the perfect foil to Tom Cruise's Maverick. While Maverick was all fire and emotion, Iceman was a glacier. He was chiseled out of marble. For those of us watching in the 80 seconds, Val Kilmer was the Adonis. Every man wanted that jawline, and every woman wanted those cold blue eyes. The movie made him a global superstar. Executives saw a leading man they could build an empire on. But critics saw something else entirely. They saw a man who was bored by his own success. Kilmer didn't want to be an action figure. He wanted to be an artist. And that desire began to curdle into something toxic. He began to believe that because he was talented, he was above the rules. He questioned directors. He pushed back on scripts. He demanded time, space, and control. On set, he wasn't chasing approval, he was chasing perfection. And perfection is expensive. Because the studio system is built on one unspoken rule. You can be brilliant, or you can be difficult, but never both. Kilmer didn't see himself as difficult. He saw himself as honest. But the seeds of the hidden antagonist were already planted. Behind the scenes, a narrative began to form. Quiet at first, then louder. Hard to work with. Unpredictable. Uncooperative. None of it showed up on screen yet. But Hollywood doesn't punish you in public. It waits. And Val Kilmer, drunk on his own potential, was walking straight into the trap. Hollywood doesn't run on talent. It runs on permission. By the early 1990 seconds, Val Kilmer had more of it than almost anyone his age. His films opened big. His face sold posters worldwide. Agents stopped negotiating and started apologizing because when Kilmer wanted a role, he usually got it. But something inside the system was already tightening. When he played Jim Morrison in The Doors, he didn't just act, he disappeared. He spent a year wearing Morrison's clothes. He learned 50 of his songs. He insisted that everyone on set call him Jim. It was brilliant. It was mesmerizing, but it was also exhausting. Studios didn't fear Kilmer's box office power. They feared his independence. He questioned notes. He rewrote dialogue. He pushed scenes past their scheduled limits. He asked, why, a word Hollywood executives hate more than no. In 1996, he said something out loud that most actors only think in private. Speaking to the New York Times, Kilmer declared that he wasn't a servant to studios, that he was an artist, and that if companies wanted obedience, they should find someone else. Hollywood listened, not to the words, but to the threat beneath them, because that sentence wasn't defiance. It was insubordination. By the time Kilmer put on the cape in Batman Forever, he was at the peak of his power. A global icon, a guaranteed opening weekend, a man who could ask for almost anything, and often did. But on set, the tension was suffocating. Director Joel Schumacher, a man who had managed massive egos before reached his breaking point. He later described Val as childish, impossible, and uncontrollable. There were stories of Val refusing to speak to crew members, of him staring down producers, of him retreating to his trailer for hours while hundreds of extras waited in the heat. And that was the problem. Because power in Hollywood is only borrowed. It belongs to the system, not the star. And the moment a star forgets that, the countdown begins. Kilmer didn't believe in playing the game. He believed the work would protect him. That talent would speak louder than politics. That integrity would outlast reputation. He was wrong. The flaw wasn't ego in the way tabloids describe it. It was something quieter and far more dangerous. Val Kilmer believed art came before obedience. Hollywood believes the opposite, and the system was about to prove it. This wasn't a bad movie. It was a crime scene. If Batman Forever was the crack in the foundation, the island of Dr. Moreau was the earthquake that brought the house down. It is known today as the black hole of cinema history. Directors were fired. Scripts were rewritten mid-shoot. Entire scenes were invented the morning they were filmed. The set wasn't organized, it was volatile. Into that chaos walked Val Kilmer, already labeled difficult, already stripped of franchise protection after turning down Batman and Robin. When John Frankenheimer took over the film, he inherited a disaster. Frankenheimer was old school. Military discipline, chain of command. Actors followed orders or they were replaced. Kilmer didn't follow orders. He challenged them. Schedules slipped. Kilmer refused to leave his trailer. Arguments exploded in front of the crew. And then came the specific scene that became legendary. The cigar incident. Whether embellished by rumor or true to the minute, the story goes that Val, in a moment of frustration, took a lit cigar and burned a cameraman's face. It was a moment of pure, unchecked arrogance. Even Marlon Brando himself, no stranger to chaos, reportedly cut through the tension with a line that spread like wildfire through the crew. You are confusing your talent with the size of your paycheck. This wasn't two egos colliding. This was the system watching one man refuse to bend inside its most fragile moment. And then, it happened. When Kilmer's final scene wrapped, Frankenheimer didn't keep it quiet. He didn't handle it privately. He exploded in front of the entire crew. Cut. Get this bastard off my set. That sentence mattered more than the film. Because in Hollywood, public humiliation from a respected director is a death notice. Not immediate, not official, but permanent. Frankenheimer told the press, "I will never climb Mount Everest, and I will never work with Val Kilmer again." Open. From that moment on, Kilmer wasn't just an actor with opinions, he was a liability. Every production meeting now included a silent question: is he worth the trouble? And the answer kept coming back the same: no. Hollywood didn't announce exile. It practiced absence. Phones stopped ringing the way they used to. Meetings happened without him. Scripts that once arrived unsolicited now came with conditions. Smaller budgets, shorter leashes. The industry didn't ask if he could still act. It asked if he was worth defending. And by the time Val Kilmer realized the doors were closing, he was already standing on the outside. But the cruel voice of fate wasn't done with him yet. Losing his career was just the prologue. The real tragedy was waiting in his own throat. See now, one of the rest, tenolation, incendation, conteldu, and den in mone severments. The enemy didn't arrive loudly. It didn't announce itself with a diagnosis or a hospital bed. It started as discomfort, a sore throat that wouldn't heal, a swelling that refused to go down. For Val Kilmer, this wasn't a crisis. It was an inconvenience one he believed he could outthink. Because the most dangerous belief Kilmer carried wasn't arrogance. It was certainty. Raised in the tradition of Christian Science, Kilmer had been taught that illness was not a physical enemy but a mental illusion. That the body could be healed through prayer, discipline, and belief without medical intervention. Doctors were not saviors. They were optional. So when the warning signs appeared, Kilmer didn't rush to treatment. He doubled down on faith. He prayed. He waited. He convinced himself that the lump in his throat was temporary, something the mind could correct. Time passed. The industry noticed changes before he did. He began wearing thick scarves, even in warm weather. His voice softened, then roughened. Meals became difficult. Speaking became painful. But admitting illness would have meant admitting that belief had failed. And belief, once questioned, collapses. By the time reality forced itself into the room, the damage was no longer theoretical. The mass had grown. It had invaded tissue that could not be spared. January 2015, Malibu. The cruelty of fate finally knocked on the door. Val was found in his guest house, choking on his own blood. It was a specific scene of absolute terror. His throat had swollen to the size of an orange. He couldn't swallow. He couldn't breathe. He was rushed to UCLA Medical Center. The diagnosis was blunt. Throat cancer. Stage 4. There would be no gentle solution. No reversible fix. Surgeons had one objective now: save his life, not preserve his career. A tracheostomy became inevitable. In a single operation, Kilmer lost the one instrument that defined him: his voice. The irony was surgical. A man who built his identity on language, rhythm, and control of breath was reduced to silence by the very delay meant to protect him. This wasn't a punishment handed down by Hollywood. It was a collision between belief and biology. And biology doesn't negotiate. There are injuries you recover from. And then there are losses that redefine who you are. For Val Kilmer, the operation didn't just save his life. It ended the life he knew. The tracheostomy was not a temporary measure. It was a permanent alteration, an opening in the throat that would handle breathing, and in doing so, steal the natural passage of sound. The voice that once commanded silence on set was gone. Not weakened, not damaged, erased. Kilmer woke up unable to speak, unable to project, unable to argue, persuade, or perform in the way he always had. Communication became mechanical, laborious, dependent on devices and patience. For an actor trained in Shakespeare, and this was not a limitation, it was an exile. Hollywood is not kind to silence. Dialogue is currency. Timing is everything. And a leading man who cannot deliver lines is not reimagined, he is replaced. Roles evaporated overnight. Scripts that once assumed his presence now ignored it. Even conversations became negotiations. Interviews were shortened, meetings were canceled, explanations became exhausting. The irony was merciless. For years, Kilmer had been accused of talking too much, of arguing, of refusing to yield. Now, when he finally wanted to explain himself, when he wanted to clarify the misunderstandings, the myths, the half-truths, he no longer had the physical ability to do so. Silence became his sentence. On the rare occasions he appeared in public, the shock was immediate. The scarves, the hand pressing against his throat to trigger sound, the strained sandpaper rasp that replaced the voice audiences remembered. This wasn't aging. It was loss made visible. The industry that once demanded his compliance now didn't know what to do with his survival. There was no framework for forgiveness, no path for reintegration. And Kilmer understood something brutal in that moment. Talent is not what Hollywood misses. Function is. Without his voice, he was no longer a problem. But he was no longer a solution either. The man who once fought every note and every frame for truth was now fighting to be understood at all. And as the world adjusted to hearing him differently, one truth settled in quietly. The Iceman hadn't melted. He had been muted. Fame hides financial decay. Until it doesn't. For most of the 1,990 seconds, Val Kilmer lived like a man who believed the peak would never end. Multi-million-dollar paychecks arrived regularly, residuals stacked, but momentum is not liquidity. Kilmer wasn't reckless with money in the tabloid sense. He didn't burn it on yachts or parties. He invested it in something far more dangerous. Permanence. In New Mexico, he poured his fortune into the Pecos River Ranch, nearly 6,000 acres of raw American wilderness. This wasn't just property. It was identity, a retreat, a symbol of self-reliance away from Hollywood's control. He called it his Cathedral. But land doesn't forgive income loss. By the late 2000s, the numbers no longer worked. Medical bills from the cancer battle began to mount. Acting income slowed to a trickle of direct-to-video paychecks. Taxes, once an afterthought, became a threat. In 2010, the illusion shattered. The IRS stepped in, issuing liens for over $500,000 in unpaid taxes. That's when the financial collapse became public. Assets don't pay debts unless you sell them, and selling meant admitting that the independence he had built was unsustainable. Kilmer resisted at first. He listed the ranch at an ambitious $33 million. He hoped time would rescue him again. It didn't. Buyers waited. Costs continued. Pressure mounted. Eventually, survival demanded surrender. He sold over 5,000 acres for roughly $18 million, far below the valuation he once believed untouchable. The land that was supposed to protect him became the collateral that saved him. Barely. This wasn't bankruptcy in headlines. There were no court scenes, no dramatic filings, just a quiet liquidation of a dream while the public wasn't looking. Hollywood had taken his leverage. Illness had taken his voice. Now reality took his safety net. The cruel symmetry was complete. The man who refused to belong to the system had built a private empire to escape it. And when the system withdrew and the body failed, that empire collapsed under its own weight. All that remained was survival. Time didn't age him. It dismantled him. For decades, Val Kilmer had been sold as a physical ideal: clean lines, sharp symmetry, a body that looked engineered for the camera. Hollywood doesn't just reward beauty, it depends on it. But by 2016, the weapon was dissolving. This wasn't cosmetic aging. It was structural loss. Surgery saves lives, but it leaves maps. Kilmer's jaw tightened, the upper lip pulled inward. The musculature that once projected confidence now carried tension and fatigue. Weight dropped. Cheeks hollowed. The neck, once a neutral frame, became the focal point, carefully concealed, carefully avoided. He became the ghost of the scarf. In every photo, at every event, the silk was wrapped tight. People whispered, was it fashion? Was it eccentricity? The truth was much more gruesome. He was hiding the machinery of his own survival. Hollywood is unforgiving to visible weakness. A leading man isn't allowed to look fragile unless the script demands it. Kilmer's fragility wasn't a role. It was permanent. Public reaction shifted from admiration to confusion. Then, to discomfort. The industry didn't mock him, it did something worse. It looked away. And there was another cruelty layered beneath the visible damage. Without his voice, Kilmer couldn't control the narrative of his own appearance. He couldn't reassure audiences. He couldn't explain. The silence amplified the change. What remained was a man carrying the aftermath of battle in his face and throat. The Adonis was gone. Not replaced by a villain, not reborn as a character actor. Just gone. In an industry that markets immortality, Kilmer became a reminder of the opposite, that bodies fail, that charisma can't negotiate with biology, that even icons are temporary. But in the wreckage of the Golden Boy, something else was beginning to stir, something that Hollywood hadn't expected. The man underneath was finally waking up. For decades, Iceman was frozen in the shadows of his own reputation. First Adab wrote, please, with Crilly down teen, since you'll pair it for, but the cruel voice of fate has a strange way of offering one last chance at grace. That chance came in 2021. When Tom Cruise decided to make a sequel to Top Gun, he told the studio something they didn't want to hear. He said, I'm not making this movie without Val. Free people. Imagine the risk. Val Kilmer couldn't speak. He was frail. He was toxic to the accountants. But Maverick wouldn't leave his wingman behind. The meeting between Maverick and Iceman in Top Gun. Maverick isn't just a scene in a movie. It is a moment of reality breaking through the screen. Iceman in the movie is suffering from the same disease as Val Kilmer. He communicates through a computer screen because his voice is gone. When they finally embrace, the world didn't see two actors. We saw two survivors. We saw the Golden Boy, who stayed on top, and the Ghost, who had finally found his way back into the light. But here is the miracle. To give Val his voice back for the film, they used artificial intelligence. They fed old recordings of his voice from Top Gun, from The Doors, from home videos into a computer to create a digital ghost that could speak for him. It was a triumph of technology, but a tragedy of the soul. He had to be rebuilt by a machine because his pride had destroyed the original. And yet, it was beautiful. For our audience watching, that scene was the payoff for 30 years of waiting. We saw that the most hated man in Hollywood had finally found peace. He wasn't the arrogant Adonis anymore. He was a man who understood that his legacy wasn't in the money or the mansions, but in the connection he still had with his fellow man. The system didn't destroy Val Kilmer. Cancer didn't destroy Val Kilmer. Even exile didn't destroy him. What destroyed the life he once had was the belief that integrity alone could shield him from consequences. But in the end, the tragedy wasn't that he fell. It was that he learned the truth only after losing the ability to say it out loud. Val Kilmer finally found his voice. Exactly when he no longer had the physical ability to use it. The Iceman finally melted, and the man underneath was finally free. So, what is the final verdict on the Golden Boy? Was Val Kilmer a victim of Hollywood or a victim of himself? The truth is both. He was a man who was given everything and who threw it all away because he thought he was bigger than the game. He was a man who believed in a miracle so much that he let his reality turn into a nightmare. But his story is not just about loss. It is about resilience. To our audience today, the generation that watched him spin that pen in 1986, Val's story is a mirror of our own lives. We all have our Iceman years, the years where we think we are untouchable, and we all eventually face the silence. We all lose our voices, our strength, our youth. Our strength, our youth. The lesson of Val Kilmer isn't about the cancer or the tax liens. It is that even after the meltdown, even after you lose your voice, your soul can still be heard. Val Kilmer lost his voice but found his peace. He stayed in the light until the very end. But for others, the fall was much darker. In the same years that Val was ruling the box office, another alpha male was becoming a legend in the sky. A man who looked like he was carved out of marble. A man who was paid $250,000 every single week to be the toughest man in America. But unlike Val, his smoking gun wasn't a choice of faith. It was a silent internal collapse that left him literally and figuratively shattered. While Val was finding his voice through AI, this legend was losing his mind and his body in a hospital room in North Carolina, forgotten by the very industry that had once worshipped his power. He didn't find a redemption arc. He found a $250,000 silence that would eventually lead him to a grave no one visited for years. You think you know what happens when the ghost of the sky finally touches the ground? You think you know the cost of being the ultimate alpha? Click the video on your screen right now to uncover the next chapter in our Tragedy and Fate series. The truth is lonelier than the silence. The file is open. Are you ready to see the end of the legend?